In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him. Yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will, or of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, 'He who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me.' From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who is close to the Father's heart, who has made him known."
Hey, good morning. How you doing? It's great to be with you. If you're a guest with us, we are thrilled that you're here. I was thinking to myself as she was reading that, because it's such a profound text. Like, John is such a fun book to have quiet times in and read devotionally, and it takes such a moron to go like, hey, we're going to study this together. There's like two different things going on there, so I'm really intimidated by John, and yet excited to just kind of spend several weeks in his prologue and just the profound nature of that. I was thinking to myself also this morning, it strikes me there are those times where healthy people have to at times go, okay, this one's not about me, it's about others. And whether you're an athlete on a team, or you're in a business situation, or even just in a family or a team of relationships, there's this clear line of demarcation where you move into a place of health when you have the ability to go like, okay, it's not always what I get out of it. And I say that this morning because it feels like that's what John does in his gospel. So let me just kind of quickly review where we went last week, because there's this question that I want to ask this morning. And frankly, if you came this morning because you're struggling in your marriage or with your kids or your finances, or even if you're just new to considering Jesus, there's parts of me that feels a little insecure because we so want to serve you and meet you in the tension of where you're at. And yet just a few verses into John, I don't think that's what he's doing. And so I'm trusting that God in his Spirit is big enough to supersede the chronology of this study that we're doing, because it seems like what he's doing is always personal, but at times he pulls us out of ourselves and kind of asks us to take this bigger view. So, last week we started into John. And again, I was so excited, and then I was like, what did I do here? This is so tricky. And here would be my best summary of what he's doing in those first few verses is John grabs this word, and it's this Greek word logos, and it was really, really important to Greek categories of thought and philosophy and religion, we might say. It was also a really important word to Jewish people and the way they thought about life and creation and God. And so John, he had to have been quite old at this point. He's writing in the 90s. He was the only of Jesus' 12 disciples to make it that deep into his life in that current version. And he starts this thing out by grabbing hold of this word that's just packed with meaning. And it seems to me that a big piece of what he's doing there is to say, hey, we all agree that there's this force, and not all that different than the way we might think of Star Wars. Like there's this force behind it all that governs, guides, controls, depending upon your persuasion as to how you think about those things. We all agree there's this wisdom behind it all. And yet what John seems to just be in awe of is all of that. It's not an abstract idea, it's a person. And there's a tremendous amount of humility that comes with going like this concept that most people have had an awareness of, he has a name. His name is Jesus. And in fact, he became human. And in fact, and we'll explore this more in the next couple of weeks, like we can know what this God is like because this God is like Jesus. If you want to know what he sounds like Jesus. If you want to know how he feels about things, God feels about them the way Jesus feels about them. And John is just welcoming them into this life that gets rid of a lot of the abstract as it relates to life and truth and wisdom and the way we think about God, and going, we can simplify this. It's in this person. But then he does this most odd thing, or at least odd in my mind, because he moves from this incredible opening few sentences to kind of bringing Cousin Eddie into the mix. Like, I don't know if you've ever been in that situation where maybe you're at some kind of meal or something and you're like, someone you invited someone there, maybe it's like a family member or like, a friend, and you kind of have to go like, hey, this isn't like F-bomb environment. And I'm not suggesting John is dropping F-bombs, but it is kind of like the Cousin Eddie thing of like, oh, geez, we're getting weird here, because it seems like that's what John does. He starts with this beautiful thing about Jesus, and then he goes, verse 6, I just want to read it again. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, the author's not talking about himself. He's talking about John the Baptist. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. And I think one of the questions we have to ask is, why so quickly? And we'll see he does this again in chapter 1 in a couple of weeks. He brings John back into the mix. And there's this question, why? And it goes into, we can go back to that blank, Donnie. I think it has to do with this. And here's this one question that I want to explore with you this morning. I think it's simple, but to whatever extent it's simple, it's equally as intimidating. It's going to bring up a lot of baggage for some of you and kind of bring up these bad experiences from your past. It gets really uncomfortable. It pushes against my default mode of wanting to exist. And I'm hoping that what you're able to identify is an area where this conversation between you and this invisible God is already ongoing. Like that there's something in your life where you go like, dang it, here too? Like that there's some theme that you can identify that's already been in place. And if not, then maybe that theme starts this morning, and that's great. But the question is something like in what ways might God be prompting you to better tell and represent his story? And that might involve a certain person who you've had this sense of like the door is cracking and you don't like to make people projects, and yet there's just been this sense of like, I think I'm supposed to have a more in-depth conversation with them about this guy Jesus. It might also have to do with your own character. Like there's something, there's a place where you're showing up that's unbecoming of who you're known to be. Like you're kind of a complainer here. I'm talking to myself. Like stop going to NICA and complaining. Just go serve. Like maybe there's this challenge somewhere of just the character that you show up with. Maybe there's a particular person that you've been treating very poorly and they know what you're about and what you do on Sundays, and God's been nudging you on that. But it is interesting to me that so quickly into the Jesus story we shift to John the Baptist, which begs this question of why. And listen, if you're studying John, what is that dessert that if you're old like me and you eat it at an Italian restaurant, it keeps you up because there's like all these layers and some of them are made of coffee dust? Tiramisu, that's the one. It's great, unless you're old like me and then you're like, why am I awake at 2 a.m? It's because that stupid dessert. John's kind of like that, though. There's like all these layers. And if you ask this question, like, why does he bring John the Baptist into it? Some of them are historical answers that I don't think they're academically important, but I don't think they're important to a Sunday morning for 25 minutes. But one of them is. And it has to do with, there's an observation here, if we could go to that slide, Donnie, that quote. One of my favorite commentators on John, he says it this way: the Word is the ultimate truth for all of human history, but is made known through witnesses, of which John the Baptist was one historical example. Now, if you're thinking things of God and trying to make sense of him, one of the things that has to get added to the mix is, why would a God who can become human, why would a God who would put his character on display through life, death, and resurrection, why would that God make himself so dependent upon me in my witness of him and to him? It's absurd. It's part of what makes me convinced that this story is real, because nobody would make this up. It doesn't make any sense to me that God's story being told in Helena on some level would be dependent upon me. I mean, there's this paradox, like God does everything and we do something, right? What if part of what's going on with John here, because remember, the author, John, his original audience is people like you and I, living lives like you and I, trying to make sense of things. It's an early church who, in their case, it wasn't particularly safe to be a Christian and to identify as one. And John, as a great artist, what he's doing in the opening chapter is introducing themes that he'll come back to throughout the book. And right off the bat, one of them is, oh, hey, and you have a role to play in this story being told. Which brings me back to that question, how might God be nudging you in all of this? It's forced me, in looking at this, to just go back to my own story, and I hate to be so narcissistic and self-referential, but it does tie in our story. Like, I remember being in my mid-20s, my wife and I, we were starting to have babies, life was getting busy, I was on staff at a church, she was starting to practice nursing, we had started this 20-something crew, so every Wednesday night we were doing youth group for students, and every Sunday night we were doing this fun thing in a club in downtown, and we had been at it long enough that we had a pretty strong community of people, some former students and some leaders and some students, and we were doing lots of things together. And then I was started to be introduced to this kind of missional theology thing, which emphasized that like God doesn't just care about your thoughts, but how you serve and treat people. And there was kind of an aha for me, because I realized we lived in this older neighborhood, and there was in hindsight, I was too young and self-absorbed at the time to fully recognize it. In hindsight, there was a widow woman who lived next to us, who certainly raised her family and lived in that house their entire lives, and now she was this homebound widow who Meals for Wheels brought her meals. And I remember, because her driveway was right next to our house in this kind of old part of Billings, and the paint was literally falling off of her house. By midsummer, the grass in her backyard was up to her knees. I remember at one point, someone came to shovel the grass and they found a dead cat, and this is gross, but they like put a shovel under it and like all these maggots like streamed out of this thing. And it was in that season where I realized, like, wait a minute, like I'm so stinking busy doing church for people that I don't have time to be the church. And the conversation that we started having semi-seriously was like, both my wife and I, but also as a friend group, was this like, well, maybe all this church programming stuff misses the point. And for me personally, being several years into vocational ministry at the time, there was this serious consideration of, I have a teaching degree, maybe I'll go get a job and teach high school somewhere, and us in this community, like maybe we'll go to a church as we know it, maybe we'll just do that living room thing, and we'll kind of circle up on Sundays, and we'll talk, and we'll pray, and we'll read, and we'll eat meals, and we'll serve people together. And it was a serious consideration. But for me, there was one piece that personally I couldn't get past, and that was my story. While I was raised in a Roman Catholic family, my story was where God really got personal was when I was 17 years old, and I started going to this, there's no other way to say it, this really awesome late modern megachurch. And things were done really well. The music was good, the art was good, the place was clean, it was hospitable. There were doors where you could sneak in and not have to kiss anybody to get in the door. I mean, it just wasn't weird in any way. And I sat in the back row for a couple years, smelled like a cigarette butt, and just kind of hung out. And if anybody would have pushed me on anything, they would have never seen me again, but it was just a safe place to hang. And part of my struggle, and I don't mean to make this about me, but I think we all have versions of this in our story. Part of my struggle was, I'm fine. Like, I could walk off into the sunset with a group of friends and just, serve God in those ways together. But I'd be creating something that's very different than what reached me. Like, I'd be giving my adulthood to being a part of something that would have never reached 17-year-old me. And frankly, that's why that same group of people, rather than hole up in our living room and slowly dwindle, which I now understand is how that works, it's why we took the invitation to come to Helena and plant a church. That there is this value of, we get to know God, but do we remember that we also have this responsibility to tell his story, to put a towel over our arm, and at times do things that don't require words? But I wonder if you're anything like me, if there's also a challenge of but sometimes they do. Looking back at verse 7, we're speaking of John the Baptist, he came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. I mean, first of all, it's absurd to think that light needs a witness, right? Like, you've never had to point out to your guests, did you see my new light bulb? It kind of does its own thing, and yet apparently it doesn't. And John, the base word behind this noun and this verb in John's gospel, which is 21 chapters long, it shows up 31 times. So John, this early follower of Jesus, speaking to a community not that unlike this one, a major theme of this story, and we'll take one more look at it this morning even, is this like, remember, you tell the story. And it's something we do collectively, and it's something we do when we scatter individually. How many of you in the, 2000s were deeply influenced by a guy named Rob Bell? Anybody? A few of you? Brilliant thinker. The first time I saw him was at a student conference, and he came out on a skateboard with a Bible in his hand. And if you don't know Rob Bell, he defines cool. It's like Zach Bushilla and Rob Bell. Like they're the cool people. And he was the former editor of Skateboarding Magazine. He planted this church called Mars Hill in Grand Rapids, Michigan, that for several years running, what was the fastest growing church in the country. In fact, they actually bought an old shopping mall. This is how massive they became so quickly. And the center court was the auditorium, and all the wings were like the classrooms and the offices. And the first time I saw him, really where I identified was, I was trained to do this by great orators. These Brian and Vern, who they are masters at writing a sermon and using really detailed, really precise language, and they're both very good at reading you their sermon without you knowing they're actually reading to you. And I grew up under them in my early 20s, and try as I could, I couldn't do it. It's just not the way my brain works, and I was horrible at it. And I remember it was just a train wreck whenever they gave me a chance to teach. And the first time I saw Rob, I was like, that I relate to. Because it wasn't that he hadn't planned what he was going to say, but he wasn't reading, and he had just a different style, and I could never get anywhere close to his style of teaching, but that's where I identified with him. Well, he frankly, I don't follow him anymore, but he was a huge influence on me in this place. And one of the things I heard him say pretty early on in the church planning trajectory was he had this long kind of philosophical treatise on how church marketing was bad stewardship. And basically his argument was, we have the most important message in the world that we say the Spirit of God is behind. Why would we put that on a billboard? And I was really influenced by that. And after a burst of a start in marketing, which was part of the church planning thing, for the first few years, we did nothing in that space. And frankly, we kind of dwindled in our influence. It was kind of a middling influence. And what changed for me is I was at a conference. It was this week-long intensive, and one of the guys in my group, and you spend a lot of time with the people in your group, one of the guys in my group, he worked for Chick-fil-A, and he was about 20 years older than me, and he was the personal coach to every Chick-fil-A owner west of the Mississippi. And I remember at one point, it was so fascinating to learn all this stuff, and he explained to me their business model, and at one point we were in a drive, I can picture where we were, and I said, so how much does Chick-fil-A spend on marketing? I don't remember what all led up to this, but I was starting to kind of rethink some of this. And he said, a local owner has to spend 15% of their gross on marketing. And then he said that at the corporate level, they spend 15%. And I remember thinking, wait a minute, we all know who Chick-fil-A is, and yet still at the local level, they're sponsoring football games, and they can do all kinds of creative stuff. But we came home from that, and it was a continuation of working on things where we determined, wait a minute, sometimes people just don't know that good things are there. And the decision even made then, it's in our recipe, this whole invest heavily in local marketing, mainstream marketing, and it's not 15%, trust me. But the value there was this, we have this responsibility for people to know that we're here. And I think we could be proud of the fact that it's never been our intent to say, come to us, we're the best church in town, but rather to go, there's lots of good churches in town, and if you're struggling in your marriage, man, you should check one out. It might help out. I remember Jenny Busher one time jokingly saying, and it's way cheaper than therapy. But it raises this question of like, what is our responsibility to do this? Well, what happened was we started doing that, and our influence grew, and I'd like to think it wasn't about size. It was just about making Jesus available as possible to as many people as possible. It was kind of the mantra. And there was a season where someone gave us a billboard on the West End, and we did lots of radio stuff, and then we shifted. There was a season where Facebook made it very, very easy, and then and affordable, and then Facebook changed their algorithm to where you only, we all know that story, so we stopped doing that, and we were in the middle of figuring all that out, and then COVID hit. And of course, most things like, well, why would you market during COVID? It's against the law to do anything, so let's not do that. It's unwise. I wasn't trying to take a shot there. I'm just saying, why would you market? And it was last spring where it occurred to us as a staff, wait a minute. It's been 3 years since we've done anything. And I say all that to say, I think part of this is something we do together. Part of what that is, part of, frankly, your giving goes to our trying to tell the story, and about 55% of that giving goes to our staff, and I'll never apologize for that. I wish it was 100, because there's no cent that we spend that's a better cent spent than when someone like Hannah or Gay or anybody else on staff is sitting with coffee. Nobody spends more time one-on-one with people than we do, and I'm so proud of that. And I think in our kind of current cultural moment, the time that we spend to set the table and make volunteering fun and not a full-time job that you don't get paid for, the staff's work there is so important. So we do it together as a church, and we're glad to do that. But look because that's what John's saying here. Listen to this. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. I mean, that's like orphan language. It's like a person meeting a biological parent who they've known the whole while and didn't know that was their parent. That's the language here. The world, they don't even know who their father is. He came to what was his own, but his own people did not accept him. Now, part of this is we're talking about ethnic Israel, but part of this is more broadly, it's humans. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. John uniquely talks about this idea of being born again, and he's saying here there's a family that does this together. It's called the church. So we do this together, and we take that seriously. And I'm not suggesting that radio ads or billboards or a staff exhaust that, but it's part of it. But part of me also wants to push you and go, okay, but for you, what are the ways God might be nudging you? And it might have to do with your own character, and it might have to do with a particular space or even a particular relationship. It might have to do with your budget. It might have to do with any number of things. It's probably uncomfortable if God's behind the nudging. And I know that part of the reason why we check out of this conversation is because it's inherently so messy. And we all have negative stories, right? We all have these hilarious but not so hilarious, shameful past stories. I can't believe I did that. I was such a jerk. We all have these stories of people who've been deeply wounded. My all-time favorite "don't do it that way" story is a friend who lives up on the hill, and he spent the morning putting a screen door on his house, a new screen door, and if you ever tried to do that, mine still doesn't latch. I've tried. It doesn't work. But it's incredibly difficult and frustrating, and so he hung this screen door and was so proud that he went to lunch, and when he came back from lunch, he could see from his driveway that his screen door had been beat against the railing and was trash. And he's like, what kind of idiot am I that I didn't even latch my screen door? And then when he got up to the screen door, what he saw was that it wasn't him. Some well-intentioned evangelist had been to his door, and they rubber banded a tract to his handle, but they didn't latch it when they left. So there's some irony, right? Blessings on you. I mean, what do you suppose his view of the whole thing is now? And we laugh, but we also go, that's what causes us to not try. Because probably a high percentage of those of us in this room, we have stories like that. And if your brain's wired like mine, we forget the stories. I think of the time when my aunt introduced me to a guy named Fred. I mean, that was a risk on her part. Why is it that I remember all the negative things that were done and all the negative things I've done, but I don't remember the first time someone invited me to this megachurch and how positive that was for me. There's this question of like, so how might God be nudging you? Because look what John does in 15, and this is why like John makes for such good quiet times, and there are certain people who could preach this effectively. The detail is overwhelming, but in John 15:26, watch this. When the advocate comes, who I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth who comes from the Father, he will testify on my behalf. So here's the good news. And I love, I just learned this phrase this week, and I just love it. Like, God does everything. Like, when it comes to who tells the story of God, the good news is, and I'm still trying to vet this one out, but best I can tell, you actually can't experience God's grace without that being a personal experience of the Holy Spirit. And the promise here is, like, God's Spirit took charge of this good news of Jesus' death and resurrection. God's Spirit takes charge of there's a rival king leading us into his original intention for creations, and you can follow this God. But then look at John's next line. You also are to testify because you've been with me from the beginning. Now he's technically speaking directly to his 12. And as an extension to you in Helena, Montana, on September 17th of 2023. And there's part of it that's nothing short of absurd. And if it's not just absurd, it's incredibly intimidating. And yet there's this question. There was this man sent by God, his name was John, who had his own story and his own kind of quirks and his own idiosyncrasies. And God used him, and he's part of the reason why you're sitting in that chair up there. It's crazy. It's the phrase, like, God does everything, but do people do something? And it applies to so many things as it relates to God and his sovereignty and his power. So I remember when I think I was 20, I was offered a job to work for this guy named Vern as an intern, and mostly my job was to stir the lemonade with my arm. In hindsight, we literally stirred the lemonade with our arm in the got pot, which is so gross. I think there's a filter on the back of that little nozzle. Just kidding. And to vacuum, and then what time was left to hang out with students. Well, I remember the first time Vern took me to Applebee's and kind of pitched this idea to me. And I was like, no. Teresa and I were getting serious. I was getting ready to go back to college. It paid $500 a month. I was like, nah, I'm gonna do something else. It was like in May or June. And I was processing with my friend Fred, and I'm sorry to bring Fred up. There's certainly been a lot of good friends and family that have influenced me. But Fred was this mentor to me in my 20s, and part of it was I come from a blue-collar background, and so that shapes me in very real ways. And so where Fred really connected with me was, Fred wasn't a pastor. He was involved with local church, but he was an insurance agent. And by the time I met him, he was a few decades into his influence of people to the point where he blocked a half an hour mid-morning and a half an hour mid-afternoon and his lunch hour because the demands on his time for people to process just marriage and life and relationship were so great at the time that's how he kind of met that need. He just had developed this reputation as someone who, he doesn't like the phrase, but like biblical counseling, biblical discipleship kind of stuff. He was really, really good at it. And so I'd spent months learning from him and listening to him, and it really connected with my family of origin and my story, and I'd really developed this vision for, like, yeah, I'm going to go teach at a high school or teach somewhere, and I just want to be one of those guys who takes God seriously and see where that leads. And so I remember when I told Fred I turned the job down, I used this phrase that, to his credit, should have been offensive, but he didn't take offense. I said to him, Fred, I kind of just want to lay in the weeds like you do. And what I meant by that was I so envied his position as a non-clergy person who was as devout in his faith as any clergy I'd ever interacted with. And I was aware then of the credibility that he had because that was the case, that I would instantly lose if I moved into that space. Now that's my own story. Obviously it didn't turn that way. But I feel like it does give me the credibility to go, hey, don't underestimate the power of your witness, because it's not your job. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me or Hannah or anyone else, but there's a cost. And the way this thing works together is if we're all living within our vocation. You have a power, because when Anna reads her Bible, that's what she's supposed to do. She works for a church. And when Lexi does something overtly spiritual, like make a decision from her life, of course she is. She's a pastor. But you're not. You're a teacher. You're a barista. You're on a cross-country team. You're a student. You're a nurse. You're an attorney. You're a stay-at-home mom. You're a stay-at-home dad. You work at Carroll. Part of the kingdom plan, it would seem to me, would be people like you who are just as sincere as your faith as anybody on this staff, who when you do things, people look. And it seems to me that the brilliance of God's kingdom plan is all of that working together. And so I leave you with this question. In what ways might God be nudging you to tell his story? I'm going to pray. Lord, thank you, God, that we get to be a part of this thing that's it's way bigger than the hyphen between our birth and death. And thanks, Lord, that you don't just ask us to be these free-wielding individuals out there changing the world for you. You invite us to do it together. And yet, God, it seems so clear in this age of deep cynicism and cultural distrust and clerical distrust that it would be naive for me to say now more than ever, but certainly now, your Spirit is witnessing on your behalf, and you're calling us to do the same. And I pray for my friends who just get to live in the weeds, that they would take seriously their own growth in you and the opportunities you give them. And then, God, I pray for our friends here that they wouldn't even identify as yours right now, and we just recognize that places like this and experiences like this can be helpful to an extent. But would you please bring teachers and community members and business owners and neighbors, ordinary, everyday people into their life that reinforce to them that there's a rival king on the loose and some of us follow him. We love you, Jesus. Amen.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook or Instagram.